So now I am excited to introduce Dr. Ron Friedman, an award-winning social psychologist who specializes in human motivation. Ron has served on the faculty of the University of Rochester, Nazareth College, and Hobart and William Smith colleges, and has consulted for some of the world's most successful organizations. Popular accounts of his research have appeared on NPR and in major newspapers, including the New York Times, Financial Times, The Globe and Mail, Washington Post, The Guardian, as well as magazines such as Men's Health, Entrepreneur, and Success. He is a frequent contributor to the Harvard Business Review, Psychology Today, Fast Company, Forbes, and CNN. His first book, The Best Place to Work, was named an Inc. magazine's Best Business Book of the Year. And his new book, Decoding Greatness, was selected by Amazon's editors as one of this year's best nonfiction books. Let's give a warm welcome to Dr. Ron Friedman.
Hi, Ron. Welcome virtually to North Dakota.
Thank you so much.
You know,
I appreciate it. It's great to be here.
Great to have you. We're going to do Dr. Friedman's presentation in kind of an interview style this morning. We're going to be covering concepts from both of his books. So if you have a question you'd like to ask Ron, please use the Ask feature, and we'll try to get those questions answered. So, Ron, you're a psychologist. What inspired you to write a book about the workplace?
Yeah, that's a great question. I started off teaching motivation in various colleges and universities and studying motivation in the lab. I actually studied with Ed Deci and Richard Ryan, the two psychologists who were featured in Dan Pink's classic book, Drive. And I was a graduate student when that book came out. And I started teaching. And what I realized in teaching is that, man, you're kind of like stuck in the same class and teaching the same material over and over and over again. That's what teaching is like. And what got me into education is learning new things. So I decided to go off into the corporate world where I served as a pollster. So my job was to measure public opinion, figure out what it is that people think, and then advise organizations on how to use those opinions to shift public opinion. And the most surprising thing for me in being in the workplace is the massive divide between the latest science and the modern workplace. And it was everything from the way that companies hired, to the way that managers motivate, to the basic layout of the modern office. There was just a massive divide. And so I turned my attention to writing a book. That book became The Best Place to Work, The Art and Science of Creating an Extraordinary Workplace. And in it, I summarized over 1,000 academic studies so that regardless of who you are, whether you're a CEO, an executive, just someone starting out, you had access to the best science on how to create a great workplace and how to elevate your performance.
So you say there's a science to building an extraordinary workplace. What does the research say that we need to be happy at work?
Yeah, it's fascinating because we are not very good at predicting what makes for a great workplace. You know, when you ask people to imagine if their workplace was created into one of the world's best workplaces, they often think about some of the things we read about in the news, those extravagant amenities, you know, the idea of having a volleyball court or having 30 restaurants. And those are great things for attracting employees. They're just not particularly good at keeping those employees engaged. And so what we need our basic human psychological needs fulfilled. And, you know, it's fascinating because this is true for any activity. Any activity where you have your basic human psychological needs fulfilled, you will elevate your performance and be happier and more engaged. And so what are those three needs? Well, the three needs are the need for competence. So feeling like you're good at what you do. You cannot be fully engaged at work unless you feel like you're good at it. And so when we think about giving people feedback, one of the things that's really critical is helping them feel like they're good at what they do. To, you know, within reason. Obviously, you don't want to mislead people, but giving them the path to get good at their job is critical for fostering engagement, which obviously has benefits for health as well. But it's not just being good at your job, it's also growing your competence on a regular basis. So if you're just doing the same thing over and over again, you're not going to be as fully engaged as you otherwise might be. And that raises all sorts of problems for organizations because organizations are optimized for efficiency. And efficiency often involves doing the same thing over and over again. But efficiency is not the same thing as engagement. And so if you're looking to build a great workplace and have your employees be fully engaged, you actually want to incorporate learning opportunities. And that's what my second book is about, we'll talk about shortly. So the first need is confidence. The second need is the need for relatedness. So feeling like you're connected to others, feeling valued, appreciated, respected, all the good things that happen when people feel like they're supported by those around them. And the third need is the need for autonomy. So feeling like you have some say in how you go about doing your job. So when we have those three basic human psychological needs fulfilled, autonomy, competence, and relatedness, we tend to be healthier, happier, more productive. Unfortunately, most organizations do a dreadful job of creating psychologically fulfilling experiences, and I'm sure we'll get into that over the course of our conversation.
Yes. So, Dr. Friedman, you write that close friendships with our colleagues helps make us more productive. So, can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, this is one of the tricky ones, right? So I think we've all heard to some extent the idea of autonomy. Dan Pink talks about it as mastery. In the research, is referred to as competence. But the third need, relatedness, interestingly, didn't make it into drive. But it is one of the three basic human psychological needs. And I think it's really interesting because it's one of the ones that is the hardest for people to fully appreciate and execute against. So for a lot of managers, even the basic idea of fostering close friendships raises all kinds of questions, because there's a perception that, hey, if I build these close friendships, that's going to lead to favoritism. That's going to lead to people joking around at the office, not really paying full attention to work. But this is why it's so critical to have data. And so we have research out of Wharton showing that if you are building a team and you want that team to be successful, one of the smartest things you can do is find people who know and like one another. And it's because friends lift our performance at work. And it's for a number of very concrete reasons. This is not just all hypothetical. Everything I do is really grounded in science. It's got to have data backing it up. And so what we know about friends is that when you work with a team of people who like and respect you, you're going to be better at focusing on your tasks and not focusing on whether or not people like and respect you, right? We often forget that that is a concern for people who don't have close friendships at work. They're constantly worried about the politics. They're worried about whether or not people respect or value their opinion. When you have friends, that fear goes away. Beyond that, you're more likely to get good feedback from the people around you. If you like and respect the people on your team, they're more likely to share information with you when you're off on the wrong path. But if they don't know you, if they don't like you, or if they just are not close to you and they're fearful, they're not going to be open with their feedback. They're going to be siloed. They're going to watch you make your mistake and stay quiet. And that's not helpful to you as an individual. And beyond that, the third issue that we often need to think about is that when we are members of a team, we're more likely to be open about asking for help. And so for all of those reasons, friends lift our performance at work, but it's not just critical from an individual perspective, it's also valuable from an organizational perspective. Not too long ago, the Wall Street Journal did an analysis about this new algorithm that very quietly scans people's performance reviews and their employee surveys and even their emails and identifies for managers flight risks. So these are people who could be on the lookout for a new job. And so what predicts whether someone is a flight risk? Often it's not how much they make. It's not how close they feel to their manager. It's the relationships they have with people on their team. And I can tell you from personal experience, I've been in organizations where I felt like, I wasn't learning anything anymore. I kind of reached the peak of where I was going to be in that organization, but I didn't leave. And the reason I didn't leave is because my team and I were working on a project and I didn't want to let them down. So loyalty to an organization, for better or for worse, is really kind of an antiquated idea now that it's so easy for organizations to replace people and for people to find new jobs because of technological innovations. But loyalty to other people, to other friends, that's not going away. And so for all of those reasons, it's vital for organizations to think about how to build close relationships.
That makes so much sense. So let's make that a little bit more practical. How can organizations foster these close relationships between colleagues?
Yeah, so this is where you want to start from the perspective of what does the science tell us. So we have very clear research on what gets people to like one another. And this is true for people who inherently don't like one another. So this is true for Democrats and Republicans, Israelis and Arabs, parents and their teenage kids. If you want people to like one another, you need to do one very critical thing, and that's help them figure out what they have in common. And it's because similarity builds connections. And so within organizations, we have to think about how do we utilize that? And there are some real opportunities for doing it. So one obvious opportunity is when you're onboarding people, right? So how do most organizations onboard people? For example, if I was to join your organization, you the viewer, probably I would be introduced the way I was introduced just now, which is by my professional accomplishments, which is great. I mean, you want to understand why the people on your team are going to provide value, but why not then go the extra step and interview employees who are about to join the company about their personal interests, things they like to do outside the office. So in my case, and you might have learned that I really like to play pickleball, that my favorite show is Succession, or that I used to like Nirvana, but now that my 14-year-old daughter blasts it throughout the house, I no longer care for Smells Like Teen Spirit. Now you have a personal attachment to me in some way, and we have something to talk about when we're on hold on a conference call. If we're traveling together for business, we can connect on something that isn't related to work. That's one opportunity. Another opportunity is investing in recreational activities where people can go out and do something together. In a lot of organizations, you know, it's a trend now, and unfortunately, for better or for worse, within workplace wellness communities, there's like this trend. Okay, it's 4:00 on Wednesday. We're all going to go into the conference room and do yoga together. That's great if you like yoga. But if you don't like yoga, or if you do like yoga, but you're not a fan of putting on spandex and doing animal poses in front of your boss, you're out of luck. There's a better approach. And that approach involves polling your employees to figure out what are the activities that they like to do outside the office, and then providing seed funding for them to go and do that together. You might find that some people are interested in cooking. You can send them off on a cooking class. Others might like to play musical instruments. You can create an office band. It's when we create those opportunities for people to bond over non-work matters that we build a path for closer workplace relationships. And a third practical strategy that I would offer is investing in social spaces. A lot of organizations don't think about the office kitchen, for example, but they spend a lot of money on their conference rooms. But close personal connections are much more likely to develop in the office kitchen than they are in the office conference room. And so you want to build inviting spaces where people can sit down and share with one another, you know, what last night's football game, or that new restaurant they just tried, or what they're doing on the weekend. You know, we have this idea that if people are talking about non-work matters during office hours, then they're somehow wasting time. But here's the revelation. It's in those conversations where people are finding their close connections that you're sowing the path now for deeper relationships, and then therefore better work.
Ron, I have a background in exercise science, so this question's very interesting for me. You say that exercise can actually make us smarter. How does that happen?
Yeah, you know, this is one of the things that people, I mean, I don't have to tell anybody here, because you guys are in the know. Most organizations are not in the know. And exercising actually needs to be perceived as part of your job. I wrote an article for the Harvard Business Review with that title of regular exercise as part of your job. And it's because exercise isn't just something you do for your health or your appearance. It actually improves your performance at work. And again, it's for some very concrete reasons. One is you get more blood flowing to the brain. And so now you're better able to sustain your focus over longer periods of time. You're activating the memory regions of the brain. So now you're better able to soak up information more quickly. You don't need to read that email multiple times or read that memo multiple times. You get it the first time and you remember it. And it puts you in a good mood. And being in a good mood is not simply something that's nice to have. Today, when we think about the type of work that we all do, we all need close personal relationships. And that starts with being in a good mood. We all know about mood contagion, where if I'm in a good mood, you're more likely to be in a good mood. That extends to customer service. If I'm in a good mood, that is going to extend to the way that customers perceive our organization. I need to be in a good mood if I'm not just appealing to customers and clients, but also to other team members to form those close relationships. So much of our work has to do with interacting with others. And being in a good mood is vital to that. And it all starts with exercise. Exercise makes you better at your job.
Well, I can certainly relate to that. I know if I go out for a walk, I certainly feel more refreshed, and I feel like I'm a little more creative, and it's just a nice boost during the day. So
yeah, and I would just add to that, Pete, if you don't mind. I would just add to that, this is something that was hard for me personally to accept before I started diving into the research, where I would just, for example, do whatever it needed to be done for work and view exercise as something I selfishly did for myself. And that shift, when I started to appreciate that when I exercise, that's an investment at work, that's what enabled me to then leave the office at 5 o'clock and go to the gym, as opposed to sending extra emails through 6 o'clock. Because now I understood it wasn't that I was stopping to work, I wasn't slacking off. I was investing in my future performance by taking my thinking elsewhere. And so, to your point, when you're walking around, you're going to get some of those better ideas.
Absolutely. So I think a lot of us have this question on our mind, and particularly us in the worksite wellness world. What can companies do to get their employees to take better care of their health?
Well, the first thing that companies need to do is they need to appreciate that this is not something you're doing in order to get your employees healthier or, just happier. Those kinds of outcomes feel abstract. This is a business investment because you're helping people improve their performance at work. So again, you're not doing it for the sake of keeping them healthy. I think this is part of the messaging needs to change, frankly. This is a business outcome. This is a business investment. So the mindset needs to change. The way we message it needs to change. And there's clear research on this. There's research that I discussed in my book, and also out of University of Leeds, that looked at what happens when people go to the gym during the day versus people who don't. And what you find, and this is the study looking at people who have a gym at the office, comparing people who exercise versus people who don't, looking at the outcomes. And what you find is that their experience at work transforms, right? So they go to the gym, but their experience at work transforms. And it's because they're more productive. They're getting more done in less time. They're having better communications with their colleagues. And critically, they're going home satisfied. And that's vital if you're thinking about retaining your top performers. You want them going home satisfied. Because if they're going home feeling frustrated, they're going to get burnt out and they're going to start looking for a new job. So that's critical, starting with the mindset, understanding this is a business investment. It's not something you're doing for health. Messaging needs to change. Secondly, beyond that, we need to make it practical. And so I know of a lot of organizations who think, okay, if we build a gym, we're done. We've done our job. And I've been consulting for organizations. They bring me in, they say, no one's using our gym. Why is this happening? And it's obviously a number of factors, but probably the most critical is that it's not practical to go to the gym during the day when there are no access to facilities like a shower that enable you to retain your appearance, particularly for women. Women have this, I hear this from women all the time, where I can't go to meetings looking sweaty. It's not going to work. Men have, the standards are a lot lower. So I hear that less from men. But we need to make it practical by investing in the facilities that enable people to realistically use it. And then third, and this is something that I heard the previous speaker mention, and I think this is absolutely true, is we need to model the right behaviors. If you have a gym and no one uses it, it's not going to get used. But if the manager uses the gym and the manager talks about their exercise regimen, that is going to change opinions. And so again, with organizations who have the gym and nobody uses it, there's going to be a stigma associated with going off in the middle of the day to exercise unless the people at the top do it. And so it's a matter of when we're doing these workplace wellness programs, we really need to get the leaders bought in to the idea and getting them really concrete about the specific behaviors that they're going to incorporate. And one easy one, and I'm sure this has been discussed today, is walking meetings. Walking meetings are a great tool, not just for getting exercise over the course of the day, but also for elevating creativity, because now you're taking your ideas and you are finding linkages, because you're surrounded by all these novel inputs as you're walking that help you see connections that you wouldn't have seen if you were in a windowless conference room. But beyond that, the reason walking meetings are so effective is because they're actually a tool for building closer relationships. And it's for a couple of reasons. One is because if you and I, Pete, go out for a walk, it's something that we are doing in the absence of everyone else. And now we have that togetherness ideal where we are doing something together in the absence of other people. We're forming a closer connection. But physiologically, when our heart rates increase as we're walking, often we misattribute that unconsciously to liking the other person. And so if you want people on your team to like you, take them on a walking meeting, because unconsciously their heart rate will elevate, and they'll associate that with liking you.
All right, well, we'll be doing a lot more walking meetings going forward. So you write that companies should provide employees with a budget for customizing their workplaces. Why is that?
It's because when we customize our environment, we experience a sense of control, making us more likely to invest our own energies towards work. So if you look around at the office, one of the best, and as people are coming back to the office, if you look around, and what you see, some people have invested a lot of time in making their desk their own, whereas other people just like have nothing. They've got no pictures of their family, just nothing. And those people are more likely to be gone in the future, much more rapidly than people who've invested in shaping their environment. And it's because it's a sign of commitment. And so if you give people the money, let's say $100, and in fact, a number of organizations have done this, subconsciously what that does is it forms a connection to the environment. It makes the environment also more controllable and more comfortable. And the more comfortable you are at your desk, the more cognitive resources you have to doing your job effectively. And this isn't just my opinion. There's research showing that if you give people the opportunity to shape their environment, their productivity goes up by 32%. And so now, as we're coming back into the offices, this is a great opportunity, if you haven't done this already, not just to give this to new people, but to offer the people on your team a small budget. It doesn't have to be huge. It doesn't have to be thousands of dollars. It doesn't have to be a huge outlay. If you have the opportunity to give people even $50, go buy something that makes your office experience a little bit more comfortable. They'll be more appreciative, and their productivity will increase.
That is so interesting, but makes perfect sense. We've talked a lot about moving around and how that's helpful for us, and exercise and walking meetings, but you've also found that sitting can help. So provided that you're sitting near a window. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, this is one of the most interesting findings that I discovered in the research. Is you can predict how satisfied people are with their job by the amount of sunlight entering the office. And it's because sunlight it improves our mood, it lowers our heart rate, and it enables us to get better sleep at night. And so there's research showing that if you take telemarketers and they generally rotate where they sit, depending on what time their arrival is. If you put some people near a window and some people away from the window, you would think that the people near a window would do a worse job because there are more distractions, but in fact, they do a 21% better job. And again, sunlight is helping them. It's helping them stay on task. It is improving their satisfaction with work, and it actually makes them more loyal to their company. So for all of those reasons, sitting can help if you're sitting near a window. And I think we've all kind of experienced this now as we have been working from home over the last year. We're going to, I think, talk later on about some of the effects of COVID and how that has benefited some individuals. And part of the reason for that is when you are able to sit near a window, that's going to help you in all sorts of ways.
Well, that is fascinating. I think I'm going to put a request in for a window office when I get back this afternoon. So, Ron, I'm not much of a gamer, but I have a lot of friends, and I know a lot of people are. But you talk about video games. So what can video games teach us about building an extraordinary workplace?
Well, video games get us to do a lot of things that we wouldn't normally be spending time doing. They get us to move around, rotating blocks. They get us to sort cards into piles. We invest hours doing it. We lose sleep. And it's not necessarily because the games are inherently interesting. What video games show us is that if you create certain conditions around a task, you can make that task interesting. And so what are the features that make video games interesting? One of the features is immediate feedback. Another is recognition when we've done a good job. And the third, and this is critical, is progressive difficulty. Video games get harder the longer you play them. They don't start off being particularly difficult. In fact, if you've played Angry Birds, then you know the first board is really easy, gets you to smile, you continue going, and then it gets harder and harder and harder. That trajectory of easy to hard is what we need in order to stay engaged at work. What we often find in organizations is that organizations have the opposite trajectory. It's because when you start a job, you first need to figure out what's really expected of you. You need to figure out what is the organizational culture, who are the major players, how do I get good at this? And then after about a year or two, you get it. and your job becomes predictable. And as I mentioned earlier, when jobs become predictable, no longer challenging, your engagement is going to plummet. And so what we need from our organizations is we need the same thing we need from video games. We need that immediate feedback, we need that recognition when we do a good job. And we need ongoing challenges. And so that becomes a really critical piece for a lot of organizations and managers to think about is if you're making your employees' jobs easier, you're actually going to have less engaged employees over the long run. What you're trying to do is give them opportunities to learn new things and grow their confidence. That's the path to fostering more engaged and more successful employees. And so thinking about how you can build in some stretch goals for the people on your team, maybe giving them a reading budget, an education budget, empowering them to go out and find courses they're interested in, rather than telling them, hey, there's this conference we need you to go to. That's actually not ideal. Better for them to say to them, hey, go find me a conference that you think would benefit you at work. If you could put them in the driver's seat, not only are you growing their competence, but you're also fostering greater autonomy.
So speaking of building competence, in your new book, Decoding Greatness, you discovered something that you weren't expecting. What was that?
Yeah, so competence is a critical thing, as we mentioned. If you're not growing people's competence, you are not going to get fully engaged employees. And in my new book, my focus was on how people who are really at the top of their field, what are they doing differently? And it turns out that what they're utilizing is a technique for improving their performance, but also learning on an ongoing basis that we can all utilize in the way that we work to grow our competence and be better at our jobs. And so, as I explained to people about this book, we are often told two big stories about how people get to the top of their profession. And the two big stories are, one, greatness or top performance comes from talent. So the people who are really top performers, they have an inner strength that they've discovered, and that they've been able to apply that to a particular field. So from that perspective, if you want to get really good at your job is to figure out what am I really good at, and then find a role that enables you to let that strength shine. The second big story is that greatness comes from practice. So this is the idea that if you just have the right practice regimen, and if you have enough discipline to practice for an extended period of time, maybe 10,000 hours, some people believe, then eventually you'll get great. What I discovered in doing the research for Decoding Greatness is that there is a third story to how people get to the top of their profession. It has nothing to do with talent or practice. It has to do with utilizing a technique called reverse engineering. So reverse engineering simply means finding great examples in your field, whether it be a presentation deck or a well-written email or a memo, and then working backward to figure out, hey, how was this created? If I was trying to recreate something like this, how would I do it? And the better you get at reverse engineering, the more you're learning on a regular basis at your job, and not just relying on opportunities to take courses or books or conferences. You can do this all the time, and it's a mindset that enables you to consistently grow your skills, which feeds your confidence, which makes you more engaged at work.
So in Decoding Greatness, you write about the way creative geniuses reverse engineer the works that they admire. Can you give us some examples of that?
Yeah. So first of all, how reverse engineering works depends on your field. So it's really interesting because what I find what I found while doing the research is that chefs, for example, will order dishes to go, and then they'll spread the sauces out on a white plate and use a magnifying glass to figure out what the ingredients were. That enables them to figure out how was this created. There are other examples like photographers. Photographers, for example, don't look at the object in the image. They'll look for clues that are hidden in the image, like the length of the shadows. The length of the shadow tells them where the light source was placed and the time of day that the photo was shot. And all sorts of examples. I have the examples of Stephen King and Malcolm Gladwell. This is how they learned to write, is they took apart other people's work. Pablo Picasso, Claude Monet, same thing. They recreated artwork that had existed and figured out how to reverse engineer it and recreate it. And that's how they developed their skills. And one of my favorite examples in the book is the example of Kurt Vonnegut, the famous writer. And a lot of people, when they think of Kurt Vonnegut, they think of someone who's really original. But in fact, one of the Kurt Vonnegut's favorite practices was to reverse engineer other people's stories. And here's how he did it. He would turn words into a picture. And how he did that was he would create a graph where the x-axis on the bottom, the y-axis at the top. On the x-axis from left to right is beginning to end. On the y-axis was how are things going for the protagonist. He would just kind of graph out the protagonist's fortunes and map it out over time. And so, are things going well for the protagonist? Are things going badly? And what he discovered by doing this for all sorts of popular stories is that there are really just 6 stories that have existed throughout time. So if you think about Netflix has thousands and thousands of movies, Kurt Vonnegut would say, forget it, there's 6 movies and you're just watching the same 6 movies all the time. And just to give you an example of how this plays out, is comparing, for example, Annie against Cinderella. According to Kurt Vonnegut, they are the same exact story with different characters. So in the example of Annie, Annie starts off, things are going really badly for her, right? She's an orphan. She's being abused by Miss Hannigan. Compare that to Cinderella. Things are going very badly for Cinderella. She's being abused by her stepmother and stepsisters. Then something good happens. Annie gets rescued by Daddy Warbucks. Cinderella gets invited to the ball, meets her stepmother, fairy stepmother. That's right. Then things go badly again. Clock strikes midnight. Annie gets kidnapped by people pretending to be her parents. And then finally, at the end, there's a resolution. Both live happily ever after. It's the same story, different characters. And we don't realize it because we're so locked into these patterns. And that's the power of reverse engineering, is when you identify the patterns that are really working underneath the hood, you can now create new work that is original to you, that builds on winning patterns. And in Decoding Greatness, I do this for TED Talks and presentations, and I show you how you can do it too. And the idea, again, is the better you get at taking apart examples that you really admire, whether they be websites, emails, presentations, whatever it is, the better you're building your skills. And you have this now mindset where you don't have to feel jealous of somebody else's really good work. Instead, you have a tool for picking the lock, figuring out how was it created, and then applying that to your next work.
So I just kind of want to touch on what you said a little bit there and just dig into this. So the idea of reverse engineering might lead some folks to worry that their work might be viewed as unoriginal. And so you found evidence that actually copying others helps make us more creative. So can you maybe just expand a little bit more on that piece?
Yeah, I'll tell you, this is probably the study that unlocked the whole idea for me and showed me, okay, there's a book here. Because I think reverse engineering is going on all the time, where this is how people learn, is they look at other examples and they work backwards to figure out, how can I apply this to my work? But nobody talks about it. And the reason nobody talks about it is because there's this fear, this stigma of, if this is what I'm doing to learn, then people are going to think I'm a copycat or I'm a hack and I'm not original. And this is why it's so critical to have data. And one of the studies that I discovered while doing the research for the book is a study out of the University of Tokyo conducted by creativity experts, where they brought in artists into the lab and they divided them into 2 groups. The first group was asked to create original drawings for 3 days straight. The second group was asked to create an original drawing on the first day. On the second day, they were asked to replicate the work of an established artist. And then on the third day, they were asked to once again resume their original drawings. And what the researchers were interested in is which of the 2 groups is most creative on the final day of the experiment. And what they found is it wasn't even close. The group that had paused to copy the work of an established artist was significantly more creative. And it's because what happens when we copy the work of someone else, when we take the time to really study it very closely, is we unconsciously compare our instinctive inclinations, what we wanted to do, against what that person, that model actually did. And that comparison of what I wanted to do versus what the model did, that opens our eyes up to new opportunities that are hidden within our own work. And so the next time you're creating your next presentation, for example, and you're worried, how do I start this? Rather than just facing a blank page, look at someone else's work backwards, figure out what's happening in the flow of it. What are they doing on slide 1? What are they doing on slide 2? What are they doing on slide 3? Find another example, do this for a few examples, and all of a sudden you're going to find that you have a template that shows you what successful work looks like that you can then utilize to create something new.
Yeah, I can see how that can be really helpful and really help someone maybe who's kind of having that mind block and they can't think of, where to start or what to do next. So I think there's a lot to that. But maybe now kind of going into the reverse of what you just talked about. So your research also shows that being too original can backfire. So why is that, and how does that correlate with the reverse of being the reverse engineering and looking to others for your inspiration?
Yeah, so this is so important to realize. So we often think that what people want from us is they want really original work. And it turns out that's not the case. We often conflate originality with creativity. Those two things are not the same thing. You can be creative by blending works from different people and not necessarily being original, like coming out of nowhere. And what the research shows us is that, in fact, we often think that original work is desired by others, but original work gets rejected all the time. And it is because, as a species, we are distrustful of the new. We don't feel comfortable with something that we've never experienced before. But what tend to do really well is work that reminds us of something we've experienced in the past, but is slightly different. And there's research backing this up out of Harvard, showing that if you look at the different the different grants, what gets funded by places like the NIH. And so there's research looking at these grant proposals, and they had experts evaluate them on their level of creativity. And the proposals that were the most creative, those tended to get rejected. The ones that were the least creative also tended to get rejected. What gets funded are the proposals that are slightly new. And researchers call this optimal newness. So what you're looking for is something that's slightly different than what has succeeded in the past. You're not looking for something completely different. You're not looking to replicate somebody else's work. You're trying to find something that has worked in the past and make it slightly different. And that formula, that way of thinking about it, I think really frees us up. Some people might say, well, that's kind of depressing because nothing original can ever succeed. And I kind of view it differently, which is this should free you up as a creative professional. If you're a knowledge worker, you're a creative professional in some way. We all need to write good emails. We all need to write good memos. We all need to do presentations from time to time. And rather than viewing your job as to be completely original, simply find a winning formula and make it your own by modifying it slightly. That gives you permission now to find all kinds of examples and just work backwards to figure out what makes them work. And that's a lot easier than trying to create something completely new.
So Ron, can you give us maybe a real life example of someone that most people consider original, but who actually succeeded by combining established ideas?
Yeah, this is one of my favorite stories in the book, and it is the story of Barack Obama. So regardless of what you think of his political views, Barack Obama, I think most people would agree, was a unique speaker. Most people think that came from talent, but in fact, Barack Obama was a terrible speaker when he first started, and he got trounced his first race for Congress. And not a lot of people know this. He ran for Congress about a decade before he became president, and he lost by a margin of more than 2-1. And the reason he lost was because his speaking style was one that he had used in the classroom as a law school professor, and people just as voters, he was as a professor, he was used to lecturing students, and voters didn't appreciate being lectured to, and they let him know at the ballot box. And so he gets crushed his first race for Congress. He thinks about leaving politics. He doesn't know what to do until one of his staff members says, hey, why don't you go check out what pastors are doing in the church to engage their flock? He comes back 2 years later, and all of a sudden he's telling stories, he's modulating his tone, he's using repetition, he's using the pregnant pause, he's using all of the techniques that work for pastors. And the rest, of course, is history. And what I love about that story is it demonstrates that, Barack Obama didn't go off into the wilderness and try to find his talent. He didn't practice for 10,000 hours to try to improve his skill. He found what was working in a different field and then incorporated it into his own. And that's an approach that any of us can use when we're trying to create something original. We can look at other fields, think about what's working over there and how do I apply that to my next project. It's a very different approach to creating original work, but it's one that can work. And I'll give you just one other example. which is Lin-Manuel Miranda. Lin-Manuel Miranda, of course, is the writer of Hamilton. He's also written In the Heights. And if you've had the opportunity to see In the Heights, it was an HBO movie that was released free over the pandemic. I think it might be out now as well. But if you watch it, it's the one he did before Hamilton. And what you notice, if you've seen both of them, is that it's very similar to Hamilton, and in that what he has done to be successful is Lin-Manuel Miranda is he didn't write something that was, I guess you could say it's completely original, but it's not. It's really just a combination of different elements of things that have worked in the past. What he's combined are the classic Broadway formula, and he's put on top of that rap and salsa. That's In the Heights. And in Hamilton, he adds another element, and that element is American history. And that's what made Hamilton such a breakout success. American history plus rap plus salsa plus the classic Broadway formula. So again, look to combine elements. Don't aim to be completely original. You're going to miss the mark. People are not going to like what you're doing. Instead, aim to combine elements in a new way.
Well, that is fascinating. It certainly seems like these concepts are being used by some very high-profile individuals throughout the world. But let's make this practical for everyone here who wants to build their competence through reverse engineering. Where do we start?
The first thing you need to do, and this is easy, you may even be doing this right now, is start a collection. Now, when we think about collections, we think about physical objects. We think about stamps or artwork or wine. That definition of collections as physical objects is too narrow. You want to widen that to think about also starting a collection for knowledge work. So I can tell you that I know a lot of copywriters. They collect headlines. I also know presenters. They collect presentation decks. Designers collect logos. So you simply want to have a place where you can keep those examples that have really stood out for you. And I talk about it in the book as creating a private museum for yourself. You want to have that private museum because now that's somewhere you can visit to find inspiration, but also, and this is critical, to compare the items in your collection versus ones that didn't make your collection. So if I've got 5 great websites that have really been impressive to me, whether they be Apple or whatever, could be in all kinds of different industries. Doesn't have to be necessarily in my industry. I can look at those websites and compare them to websites that didn't make my collection and look for key differences. You can't help but compare. When you do this comparison, you can't help but notice what it is that differentiates the ordinary, the items that didn't make your collection, from the extraordinary, the items in your collection. So when you're doing that, you're able to spot the difference and identify some of those key contributors that make that successful work unique and resonant. And all of a sudden, you now have ideas about how to create your next iteration by incorporating some of those elements. But unless you're doing that comparison, you're not going to get there. So starting a collection is key. You can do this by simply bookmarking some of those great works as you come across them. You could put them in a knowledge management system, like some people use Evernote. Honestly, the easiest way to do it is just to bookmark them. You can also, if you wanted to, put them in a Google Doc, but you just want to have some place to go so that when you encounter great works, you're capturing it and not just moving on to the next thing, because by having that collection, you're going to have a great starting place for creating your next work, but also getting those influences when you need. And this is something we can do on an organizational level as well. This isn't just a strategy for individuals. If you work with a team, you guys produce decks, or you produce research documents, or you produce outlines, whatever the case may be, you want to have a best of directory that people can go to and view some of those samples to get some inspiration so that they're not building from scratch.
So, Ron, one of the tools that you described that is especially helpful is reverse outlining. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes. So reverse outlining is a tool that can be extraordinarily helpful to you when you're trying to figure out what is it that makes this work unique. So everyone has heard of outlining. Outlining is when you bullet point the points that you want to put in a finished piece. Reverse outlining is working backward from a finished piece and going backwards to figure out what are the bullet points that I would have used if I was writing this. And critically, this is something you can use for someone else's work, not something you have to do for your own work. So, I might take a TED Talk, which I do in the book, and I show you how to reverse outlining, meaning rather than simply looking at the transcript and trying to read 20 minutes worth of information, you can reduce that into bullet points of this is what the speaker is doing in the first minute, this is what they're doing in the second point, this is doing the third point. And now that forces you to step back and you can see the totality of the piece all at once rather than experience it word for word. And so in Decoding Greatness, I do this I mentioned a TED Talk. I do it for Sir Ken Robinson's TED Talk. And what you find when you look at his TED Talk is you see some very, very obvious differences between his talks and other people's talks. But critically, when you do that reverse outline, you're able to see how there's a pattern to the way that he is speaking, where he's very positive at the beginning, he's more negative towards the middle, he's more positive at the end. And that pattern, like we talked about Vonnegut, that pattern exists through all of these TED Talks, but you can't find it unless you're reverse outlining. And it's a very simple technique, but it's one that's incredibly powerful at forcing you to step back and recognize some of those hidden patterns that are embedded within resonant works.
Let's just do 19 and 20.
All right. So your first book, The Best Place to Work, came out long before COVID. How has the workplace changed in your estimation over the last year? We've been getting a lot of questions in the chat around this, and so just curious on your assessment of that.
Yeah, there's no question that it has been a preposterously turbulent and stressful time. And obviously, not just for folks who have suffered from COVID, but also for people who've been, or people who lost their job, people who retained their job have taken on so much. The borders between work and home have shattered, and it's become really difficult to avoid burnout. That said, there have been some positive outcomes that I want to highlight that I think could make a lasting impression in a way that benefits workplaces moving forward. And I think the first point is to realize, if you look at Gallup polls, is that engagement has actually increased over the time of COVID compared to before. And so the question is, why is that? Why did engagement go up? And in many cases, because we've stripped away some of the distractions that were making work terrible. So, for example, there's no more pesky commutes. There is no more non-essential business travel. There are fewer, for people who have kids at the beginning, it was really rocky figuring out how to find a quiet place. But once people discovered that quiet place or came into a routine, they actually had fewer distractions during the workday, where there wasn't that stop and chat that we are accustomed to. Hey, you have a minute? Can you join me at this meeting? We were actually able to do focused work for extended periods of time. So I'm heartened by that. I'm heartened by the idea that we're now able to see some of those benefits and seeing those ideally translate now into workplaces as we're going back into the office. The other thing is that people, I think managers particularly, began to see the benefit of investing in physically recharging over the course of the workday. There was a study that came out in the middle of COVID that showed that 33% of workers were napping during the day. People were going out for walks more, they were running more. And I can't say enough about the value of restocking your energy over the course of the workday. We are accustomed to working for 8 hours a day. I think we're productive for about 2.5 of those hours, ideally. And the rest of the time is filler. It gets used up by, cyber loafing and all kinds of activities that look like work, but aren't really work. But when you restock your energy over the course of the workday, you actually have much better productivity over time. And I think just generally, there has just become a greater acceptance of the idea that, wait a second, we actually can be more productive outside the office. And it wasn't just managers who were the holdouts. I think a lot of employees were really dubious about the idea that they could work from home. And we have plenty of research showing that it fulfills people's autonomy just as much as it does productivity. And obviously the two are linked, where if you have a choice in where and when you work, that's going to lead you to be more engaged at the office and consequently be more productive at work. And so those are some of the trends that I think hopefully will follow us as we return back to the office. And, what I would say is that I think we're going to return back to the office. I don't think that the office is going to disappear, but I think we're going to be a lot more intentional about how we use our time at the office than we were before.
So, Ron, we've seen a monumental shift in how people are working, where they're working from. In your opinion, what's the workplace going to look like 10 years from now?
It is hard to predict exactly what the workplace is going to look like, but here's some trends that I've noticed even before COVID that I think are going to continue. One is that I think we're going to get a lot more analytical about when and where we do our best work. We have very clear research, for example, that people are more productive if they're working from home to a point, right? So if you look at people who work full time from home, they tend to be a little bit worse off than people who work at the office full time. But people who work part time from home and part time at the office, their engagement tends to be higher than people who work at the office full time. So those types of analytical analyses are going to be key. I really do think we're going to get much better at figuring out when and where people do their best work, so that we don't necessarily have to work more hours, but we utilize our best hours more effectively. And to that point, one of the things that we as individuals, I think, are going to get a lot better at is figuring out our own physiological patterns of when and where we do our best work. And so we know, for example, that early birds are going to be a lot more effective between the hours of 9 and 12 than they are in the afternoon. But night owls have the opposite status, where they tend to do their best work in the evenings and afternoons. And to the extent that we're utilizing our best hours to do our focus work, we can actually be a lot more effective and spend a lot less time at the office. And so some of those data-driven trends are ones that I am heartened to see take hold. The other thing I would say is I think more and more and more organizations are starting to recognize that if you want people to do their best work, you can't have them work around the clock. It's just not effective as a means of getting people productive. And so you're seeing more organizations actually encouraging people and incentivizing them to take time off. And so in The Best Place to Work, I talk about the example of VW that turns off their server after a certain hour of the night, so that people, even if they want to send an email, it's not going to reach the other person until the following morning. Daimler, another auto manufacturer, they have a system where if you're away on vacation, the autoresponder says, "Hey, Pete's away. If you need to reach someone, here's Shannon's email. And oh, by the way, this email is going to be deleted. So if you still need to reach Pete, resend it after this date." And it's a way of empowering you to actually enjoy your vacation, not checking your email during vacation, because even if you checked it, it wouldn't be on the server. You wouldn't be able to find any emails. But more importantly, it keeps you from being buried when you get back to the office, right? So this is one of the reasons people don't take their vacation time, is they're too concerned with how much work they're going to have to do when they get back. That's not an effective tool, right? You want people taking their vacations, because unless they're taking their vacations, they're not going to produce at a high level. And to the point about vacations, we're seeing more organizations incentivizing people to take their time off. So one of my favorite examples in The Best Place to Work is the example of Full Contact, a software company in Colorado that gives their employees a $7,500 bonus after they come back for vacation if they can manage not to check their email once. And so you're seeing more and more organizations paying people to take time off, paying them to really incentivizing them to utilize their vacation days. And that recognition that we do our best work, we're restocking our energy and we're not working around the clock, that's one that I'm hoping really takes hold.
Wow, interesting insights. I think we're all keeping an idea on this, our eyes on this, to see what happens. Very interesting about the vacation time and not checking your emails. Being plugged into work 24/7 isn't what all it's cracked up to be, that's for sure. So,
couldn't agree more.
Ron, we just want to thank you. This was just a great, interesting conversation, and your ideas are fascinating. I have read both of Ron's books, and for those of you that are lucky enough to get Decoding Greatness, you're going to enjoy it, and so there's some great nuggets in there. So once again, thank you, Ron, for being with us today. We really appreciate your time, and we have a few more things to wrap up for this event, so thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.